Our exhortation today will be provided by Brother Mike Petrarca. His title is God's Help, and in preparation for what he's going to say, he's asked us to read Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good report. Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it, being dead, he speaketh. By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had translated him, for before his translation he had this testimony, that he pleased God. But without faith it's impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world, and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed, and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore sprang there even of one, and him as good as dead, so many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore innumerable. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. By faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, that in Isaac your seed shall be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith Jacob, when he was a-dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph, and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel, and gave commandment concerning his bones. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than their treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians essaying to do were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah and David also, and Samuel and all the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might attain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Let's now give our attention to Brother Mike on the subject, God's help.
Thanks, Brother Randy, for a bit of a longer reading this morning. Thanks for all the patience from you. Good morning, and it's great to be with all of you this morning. Full house, which we're always happy to see. So we read Hebrews 11 today. Of course, characterizes the faithful of old. And my title today is God's help. So when we read our Bibles and reflect back on the amazing faithful followers of the past, we can easily put them on a pedestal. We read today of the faithful believers of the Old Testament that were commended for their faith and the actions that their faith produced. I don't want to come off callous and be disrespectful of those great acts, because they were incredible and amazing and something for us to be in awe of. But I believe if we put these faithful acts so far above us, we can lose some of the other lessons we could learn from their lives. We can sort of view them as super believers, as having immense faith, far greater than we can imagine ourselves having. While the challenges they may have faced could be greater in some sense, we need to view them as normal people just like us. They dealt with similar emotions as us at times when asked to believe and perform faithful acts. They sought out guidance from God and helped to overcome their challenges and hardships. They had to work hard for their faith too. I'd like to turn over to Matthew chapter 26, and we'll read verses 36 to 45. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, And he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Jesus, when faced with his heroic, faithful act, was sorrowful and troubled. Jesus even phrases his emotions as being sorrowful to the point of death. Even for Jesus, at times it was a struggle to remain faithful. And of course he did. He overcame and remained faithful to the point of death on the cross. But we read that this experience of struggle and suffering that Jesus went through were valuable for him and for us as he takes on new roles following his resurrection. If we could turn over to Hebrews 4, we're going to read verses 14 to 16. "Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." We read that because he was tempted in every point as we are, he is able to sympathize with our weaknesses. And our call to action is to confidently draw near to Jesus for mercy, grace, and help in our time of need. A similar concept or call to action is brought out in Hebrews 2, verses 1 and 2. Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2, excuse me. Those are the verses immediately following what we read this morning with Randy. So Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2. "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." These verses, of course, highlighting, they're following the highlighting of the faithful of old, the journeys and struggle, and ultimately the faith of the brothers and sisters of old. With reflection on this, we are called to let everything that weighs us down go and look to Jesus again, of course. But why the struggle? Why does life feel so difficult at times? Why do we go through the trials that we do? Hebrews continues and gives us the reason, starting in verse 3 of the same chapter. "Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? for they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. We go through trials and struggles because God loves us. We are his children, and he disciplines us to shape us into the type of faithful people that will inherit his kingdom, and ultimately be more like his Son and himself. And by being molded into those faithful people, we can show God's love and characteristics to others as we are instructed by Jesus in John chapter 13. This is just 2 verses, so I'll just read it quickly. John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. A new command I give to you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. By being molded by God and following after Jesus, we belong to Jesus and therefore show others what God and Jesus has to offer. We are being shaped to further God's plan and message to bring him glory in the way that we live. If we flip back over to Hebrews 11, we notice that all the people highlighted in this chapter did something. The chapter repeats, by faith, followed by a verb. By faith, Abel offered. By faith, Abraham obeyed. By faith, when they faced a struggle or challenge, they overcame their trial. And that's the concept I want to get at today. Ultimately, it's their faith that was the fuel that helped them overcome, that helped them have these great acts. Faithfulness that God would take care of them, faithfulness that he would fulfill the things that he had promised. Unfortunately, faith is not just a light switch type of attribute. We can't just flip on the switch and know that the room will be lit indefinitely. We have a moment where our faith comes to us, and we have utter belief and are converted, perhaps, but faith can be fragile. There are times when the light can become dim, or the room can even feel dark and dingy. We are to mind our oil lamps. We are to keep our lamps burning, is the analogy and parable that Jesus gives to us. To have faith is not a one-time effort, but a continuous goal that we must be mindful and aware of at all times. Jesus shows us this when he speaks of running the race in Hebrews 12. He says we must run with endurance, continuing to run and put in the effort. This run is a marathon and not a sprint. So what can we learn from the faithful of old and from Jesus that can help us keep our endurance on the journey of faith? So today we'll try to key in on a couple of characters mentioned in Hebrews 11. We'll start with Moses, and we'll pick up the story in Exodus chapter 3, if you'd turn there with me. So Moses in Exodus chapter 3, he comes out of Egypt, and he is keeping the flock of his father-in-law in Midian. God appears to him in the burning bush, and he is chosen by God to be the deliverer of Israel out of the hands of slavery in Egypt. We read, of course, of Moses in Hebrews 11 as this faithful character, one that overcame great trials, including but not limited to having this role as the deliverer of Israel. But let's pull back some layers. We'll start in Exodus chapter 3, verse 11. This is Moses speaking. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God's response in verse 12, "And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Moses replies in verse 13, "So I suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" We can see here that Moses certainly had some misgivings about this task God has put forth in front of him. He isn't confident that he should be the one to do this, nor is he confident about what to say to the Israelites or to Pharaoh, as we'll see later. We see relatable emotions from Moses here in Exodus. He lacked confidence, he was fearful, he was anxious, all things that we can struggle with when we are faced with our trials and struggles. The immediate answer from God is one that we should always be mindful of in our own lives. God will be with us. If we are striving to follow after Jesus, to manifest God in our lives the best we can, God will always be with us. The rest of Exodus chapter 3 is God giving Moses a more in-depth outline of his journey to delivering Israel out of the hands of the Egyptians. God gives Moses explicit instructions, what he should say and what God will make happen by his power to bring about Israel's escape from captivity. For our purposes, though, we are going to skip down to Moses' response to all of this in chapter 4, starting at verse 1. So Exodus chapter 4, verse 1. Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" Right after God's exhaustive instructions, Moses comes back to God and says, "What if it doesn't work? What if they don't believe me?" This is so relatable for us. We see an opportunity to do something good or rise to serve others or God, and we play the what if game. We are worried that our efforts will be unsuccessful, or we'll find ourselves in awkward situations. Perhaps we'll be met with opposition, and we need to remember that God is working with us, just how God reminds Moses here. And just for a moment, I'm going to jump over to Matthew chapter 10, and you can stay in Exodus. Matthew chapter 10, verse 19. "When they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. It is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you." This passage is speaking of perhaps far greater circumstances that Jesus' disciples would be facing than we might encounter in our lives. But the principle remains that we should be bold and not worry as followers of Jesus. If we are faithful and trust in God, we will be given the right words when the time comes. So jumping back to Exodus, at verse 3 again. "What if they do not believe me?" Verse 1, Exodus 4, verse 1. "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you?' Then the Lord said to him, 'What is in your hand?' 'A staff,' he replied. The Lord said, 'Throw it on the ground.' Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, 'Reach out your hand and take it by the tail.' So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and turned back into a staff in his hand. 'This,' said the Lord, 'is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you.' Then the Lord said, 'Put your hand inside your cloak.' So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, the skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. 'Now put it back into your cloak,' he said. So Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, 'If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these two signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground.'" God is giving Moses the help that he needs, the confidence that he needs to complete the task that God has set out for him. Moses asked for help, and God responded. He will respond to us when we ask as well, but we need to be willing to admit when we need the help, and we need to ask for it. But again, Moses downplays his own abilities in verse 10 and also God's blessings in a way. Moses says to the Lord in verse 10, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and of tongue." Moses doesn't believe he has the right characteristics or talent for the task God has given him to perform. This can happen to us all too often also. Opportunity knocks for us to serve God, and we think we aren't qualified or that someone else would be better suited for the task. God's response shows that he believes Moses is more than capable, as we read on in verse 11. The Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." Verse 13, "But Moses said, 'Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else.'" Even with that statement from God, Moses doesn't believe in himself and asks God to spare him this task. In verse 14, God responds with anger, but with an alternative for Moses. Verse 14, "Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, 'What about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I'll help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. But take the staff in your hand so you can perform the signs with it.'" Even here we learn that when we are lacking faith, God is willing to work with us, just like he worked with Moses. He and Jesus can provide us help along the way from our brothers and sisters, just as Aaron was able to help Moses. Our second character we'll look at is Sarah, and we'll go to Genesis chapter 18. So Genesis chapter 18, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead to verse 9, but for some context, God is appearing to Abraham and Sarah in kind of a peculiar way here. The text reads that the Lord is speaking, and then three men appear before Abraham. The Lord continues to be speaking while the men are present, visiting with them, while no dialogue is provided from any of the men. Abraham also addresses the Lord here. So for our purposes, we will treat these men as angels and God speaking through them. I would be interested in hearing any other interpretations, but for our purposes, the specifics won't affect what we are seeking to take from the Lord's commentary. So Abraham and Sarah prepare a meal and visit with the angels, and the Lord speaks to them in verse 9 through the angels. They said to him, where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "She is in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is that anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "No, but you did laugh." So upon receiving news from the Lord that she would conceive, she laughed. She questioned that God could make this happen. And even after this being pointed out, she denied it and lied before God. And yet, we find her outlined and specifically praised for her faith in Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11, verse 11. "By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised." So at some point, Sarah changed her outlook and considered God's promise something to be trusted in. Our first reaction to what God has laid out for us isn't always going to be the best. We don't always act faithfully when we have a trial or even a blessing. Just as we don't always act faithfully when we have a trial or even a blessing, just as Sarah received. And unfortunately, we don't always trust in God's ways, and maybe not even his promises at times. But we have to keep striving for that faith as Sarah did. And as Jesus instructed, we need to run with endurance. And we read later in Sarah's life that she stumbles and falls. She and Abraham lied to King Abimelech about their husband and wife relationship, and they deal harshly with Hagar and her son. Faith takes work and continuous effort. Even those praised for their faith had pitfalls. My goal for us today was not to downplay the accomplishments that the faithful of old had through their faith. My goal for us is to realize that they overcame similar emotions, misgivings, and doubts that we have, and that it wasn't always easy or perfect for them. They struggled just as we do. We need to learn to have perseverance with our faith just as they did, to keep moving forward when things are hard, to ask Jesus and God to strengthen our faith along the way. We are God's children just as they are. And I'd like to start to wrap up back in Hebrews chapter 12. We'll start at verse 7. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall I not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness for those who have been trained by it. And to bring us back to Jesus, where we started, we remember that he suffered, and in that suffering, our trials and struggles have hope. We go to Hebrews 5, verses 7 to 9. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Jesus struggled as we do, but he overcame where we fall short. But we take heart. As we read earlier, we have him as our high priest and savior, one who is willing to help us in our time of need.